We want to welcome our other two regulators to the stage. Kavita Jain is the Director of Emerging Regulatory Issues at FINRA, and Dwayne Posa is the Assistant Director of the Federal Trade Commission for Financial Issues. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Dwayne. I think some of you are regulars at this panel in the past, which they tell me it's always been a popular panel, so thank you for joining us. I'd love to pick up where Tony started to take us on the question of the sort of pendulum swing that sometimes happens in the compliance world. I've been in compliance longer than any of you, I feel confident in saying. And you do see this attitude that takes hold, that you've got a new administration, there's a perception that maybe they won't be as aggressive, and then people cut budgets. But if it were true that there's less pressure today, it's also an opportunity to invest in some RegTech that can really build some efficiency. But let me start with you, Kavita. Just talk about where you think we are in the regulators thinking about how to do compliance and RegTech.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Nice to be here. So I'm with FINRA. For those of you who are not familiar, FINRA oversees securities broker-dealers in the US. And I would say that within the securities industry, the focus on compliance has not decreased. I would say that there's increased focus and desire to identify tools and technology that can be leveraged to create efficiencies. So not necessarily replace, but to augment current compliance functions. FINRA we recognize that technology brings great benefits both to the industry and also to investors at large. And in support of that, we launched an innovation outreach initiative last year. And the goal of our initiative really is to understand how the industry is using technology, whether it's consumer-facing, whether it's for compliance, and how that impacts our stakeholders. And another important goal is really also for us to understand and learn from the industry what areas of our rules and programs and services could be modified to assist in the adoption of technology. And obviously, all that has to be done within the guardrails of investor protection and market integrity. In support of that, we've been hosting a lot of roundtables and other engagement efforts. And RegTech comes up as a topic almost at every meeting we have. We've reached out to a lot of specific firms and vendors to understand what role RegTech is playing in the industry. And now we are kind of doing an introspective review to think about how RegTech fits within our regulatory framework.
So people use the term RegTech in two ways. We have RegTech for regulators along the lines of what the FCA is trying to do. And then we have RegTech for compliance, which most of the people in this room are involved in. Dwayne, how is the FTC looking at either or both of those issues?
So I think first I have to give the standard disclaimer that the views I express here are mine alone and not those of the commission or any commissioner.
Very compliant of you.
Yes. Generally, the FTC has jurisdiction over non-bank, over most sectors of the economy, lots of fintechs, except for banks. We endeavor to put out as much sort of guidance as we can around consumer protection, avoiding unfair and deceptive acts practices. So I'll focus on one thing, which is data security. I think going back to Joanne's question of what the sort of regulatory landscape is right now, I think the more that companies are dealing with sensitive consumer financial information or other data from consumers, that puts a lot of impetus on the company to make sure it's adequately secured. The FTC has brought over 50 actions involving data security breaches or just having inadequate data security, even if there hasn't been a breach. So in addition to enforcement actions, we've also put out some sort of guidance. We have a series called Start with Security that sort of attempts to distill the lessons of a lot of our cases. And I think that an area where RegTech really can play an important role is helping companies, both large and small, especially as they sort of scale up, understand the weak points and where they need to make sure that things like sensitive consumer data is secured, because ultimately the impetus is going to be on the company to make sure that happens and avoid things like data breaches or disclosing private information and causing consumers to complain.
So let me, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, we use the term RegTech for both how the industry uses RegTech to assist with its compliance efforts and how regulators use RegTech to assist with our own supervisory and surveillance efforts. I should say that the other term I've heard used in that context is soup tech. So if there's no shortage of
I knew you were going to say
in our
that.
industry.
I disapprove of soup tech. It
I do
sounds
too.
like chicken noodle or something. We should have super tech. The regulators should call their regulations super tech, in my opinion. I'm losing that battle, though. Soup tech is catching on.
And if I may just put in a plug, FINRA has been a leading adopter of emerging and innovative technologies to assist with our own supervision and surveillance efforts. We were one of the early adopters of cloud in the securities industry. We use artificial intelligence in our market surveillance program. We use natural language processing extensively to assist with risk-based reviews. We have a big data analytics team. So we're trying to keep up with technology ourselves.
I have the pleasure of serving on FINRA's FinTech committee, and I've been very, very impressed with everything that you're doing. Tony.
I just wanted, before you moved on just the RegTech issue, is this CFPB or whatever they're called now, they're going to examine that if it becomes a prominent or distinctive third-party service provider for those particular companies that come within their direct jurisdiction. They're going to examine for two things. One, because they're a third-party service provider, directly what their issues may or may not be. But second, as part of their compliance exam, if RegTech has moved into some of the compliance functions, they're going to want to look at that.
Yeah, that's such a key point, because in this room we've got people who are selling RegTech services and buying RegTech services, and one of the really challenging conundrums is, as highly regulated institutions, how and when can you work with, say, a startup company that doesn't have decades of track record and so on? What are your thoughts on this, any of you, on this third-party risk question as regulators? What should the audience understand about how to navigate that?
So the supervisory highlight specifically said that the CFPB, this was in late 2017, was going to take a look in their next exam cycle at third-party service providers, especially, like I said, where they're performing either the compliance function, but certainly where they might have a high consumer touch. So that would be two things I would look at.
Yeah, I mean, at FINRA, we have had several public notices that speak to this. Firms can outsource their compliance functions, or any function for that matter, but they can't outsource their responsibility associated with those functions. So we are constantly encouraging our firms, broker-dealers, to conduct extensive due diligence of a vendor before they onboard, and to conduct ongoing due diligence to ensure that they have strong policies and procedures in place around that relationship, and that they actually follow through those policies and procedures.
Yeah. Dwayne, were you going to say something?
I would echo that. I do think that that the companies do have to keep close eye on third parties that are involved. Particularly, I would go back to like data security and consumer privacy. Particularly if you're allowing a third party access to sensitive information, it's definitely something that needs to be monitored closely.
I have a podcast show, which is free on iTunes. It's called Barefoot Innovation. And I did a podcast with Nick Cook, the head of the FCA. We're going to do another one next week. Not the head of the FCA, the head of the FCA's RegTech office. And one of the things he said in the podcast was, I don't understand why more regulators aren't doing sort of sandbox or pilot testing of RegTech. If you do it on RegTech, you don't have consumers as guinea pigs like you do with a FinTech sandbox. And I know, of course, the acting director of the Bureau just said he's going to proceed with some kind of a sandbox program. The OCC has thought about doing, they're trying to organize to do pilot testing. But do you think there's an important place for creating sort of a safe space for some experimentation in RegTech so that people can try things in a controlled environment without, in a way that we can be sure it won't destabilize the system or do harm?
So the CFPB, or whatever we want to call it now, had the office of the Catalyst Project.
Right.
And in addition to the Catalyst Project, they had the no action letter process, and I think they're called the Office of Innovation maybe now. And I think as part of that, they used to have something very similar to a sandbox out in, I think, San Francisco called office hours, in which people could come in and discuss what it is they were hoping to accomplish in a particular market. So the seeds are there, at least they are at the Bureau, and I can't imagine that they wouldn't be in some of the other regulators.
So the FTC doesn't have a formal no action letter policy. The flip side of that is we have a pretty much open door policy. Groups that want to, or businesses or self-regulatory groups, whatever, that want to come in and talk about particular issues and sort of advocate for their position can come in and we'll talk through specific issues. When you're talking about consumer protection, obviously, it's tricky. A company doesn't want to bring out a product to market that has a risk of hurting its own consumers, right? So it's definitely the kind of thing where we'll work through an issue spot, although we don't have a formal process to do sort of a sandbox.
Yeah, and Joanne, as you know, it's something that we've been thinking about for some time now. That was one of the big reasons for us to launch our innovation initiative. We also have a membership application program group where entity that seeks to become a broker-dealer, you have to go through a formal process. And one of the things we've done over the last few years is really have people from our FinTech and Innovation Initiative group participate in that process so we can really hear and understand what kind of new business models entities are looking to set up. We also, similar to the CFPB, we've started hosting FinTech office hours. So we have our annual conference next week. We have a FinTech track, and we have FinTech office hours, again, with the idea of encouraging people to come in and talk to us.
All the US agencies at this point have some kind of an innovation initiative underway. Some are very high profile, some are pretty subtle. The FDIC held its first ever innovation conference about a week ago, and it was extremely good. And they too have a task force on innovation. So there's a lot of movement, although we do have a special challenge in the United States because we have many regulatory agencies. If you talk to people in other parts of the world who have like a bridge system where their regulator can have a reciprocal arrangement with another country and sort of passport people to meet their standards, they'll say, in the US, we don't know who to build a bridge to. There's there's 5 bank supervisors and so on at the federal level. Do you have thoughts either in the US or globally on which agencies are sort of the models that people should be looking to?
You asking us to pick one?
Well, it was in our pre-question, so I figured.
No, I'm joking.
You don't have to answer that if you don't want. The FCA is head and shoulders, frankly, ahead of the rest of them.
Yeah, I mean, the FCA definitely has been a leader in this space, as we all know. ASIC in Australia has done a lot in this space too. The Singapore Monetary Authority has done a lot as well. So one of the goals of our innovation program also is to enhance collaboration and coordination with other regulators, not just domestic, but also internationally. And part of it is a learning process, where we want to learn what's working, what's tried and tested internationally, and we want to coordinate with our domestic agencies to make sure that whatever new policies or rules we come out with are not conflicting.
Are you seeing a growth in coordination among the U.S. regulators on these issues? Do you find yourselves talking with each other more?
Yes, we do. I mean, I think you make a good point that, within this relatively fragmented regulatory structure that we have, at least as compared to many other countries, that is sort of a fact of life. But I think all of the sort of big regulators have set up these touch points, these innovation offices, that are, people who are enlisted with the job of interfacing with industry and understanding where the technology is going and trying to provide some sort of guidance or conversation with it, and think about, the way their actions affect innovation. So I think that's good, and it also has been helpful, at least from my experience, in terms of interagency coordination, because there are those people that you can pick up the phone and talk to when there are these areas of overlapping jurisdiction.
There is a lot of innovation underway, too, that hasn't necessarily been labeled RegTech, but is. And Kavita, your point that FINRA and the SEC use artificial intelligence and machine learning to look at market patterns and search for financial misconduct. Can you talk more about how that works? I saw a speech by the head of economics or something at the SEC saying, a year and a half earlier, he had to Google what artificial intelligence was or something, and now they're using it.
Yeah, so there are two areas at FINRA where we're in particular trying to leverage a lot of artificial intelligence and big data analytics. One is in our market surveillance group, which is the group that provides surveillance services to all the major equity and options exchanges in the US. There we're using machine learning to help enhance our pattern detection, so whether it's for market manipulation, spoofing, et cetera. And again, we're using it to augment our analysts' efforts so that by the time they get the alerts, there's already been a pre-screening at the first level. The other area is where we use big data analytics to look across the various databases that we have within FINRA and be able to leverage outside external data sources, both structured and unstructured, to look for indications of fraud. So whether it's around a high-risk broker that's been moving from firm to firm, who was disbarred and is still engaging in activity that he or she is not supposed to, or whether it's a brokerage firm that continues to hire high-risk brokers, individuals. And that's where big data analytics really has helped helped us in going through the first level of issue identification and issue spotting.
One of the part of the vision that seems to be emerging is that the regulators may begin to offer the industry an option to be regulated under a RegTech data-intensive channel and basically plug in with an API, give the regulator access to your data in real time and full data sets and no periodic reporting and no more sampling and so on, and then reduce the regulatory machinery around you if you can prove that your outcomes are meeting the goals. That would be a big leap, but it's definitely in the mix as a voluntary choice, so the industry could choose. Have any of you been working with the issue of machine readable regulation? Not machine executable, but just this idea of tagging your regulations so that a machine can read them and make compliance easy.
Mike?
Go ahead.
Sorry, we're doing a lot in this space, so I feel like I have a lot to share. So our rule book, first of all, is already available electronically in a digital form. It's in HTML, it's searchable, there's some level of metadata that's already there. So I feel like in that sense, we're already one step ahead in the game. Machine readable rule book is something that we've heard a lot in our roundtables. So we're exploring the idea. The difference, as you mentioned, in FCA's regulatory regime and in our regulatory regime is that we're so fragmented. So firms have to work with several rule books, both at the federal level and the state level. So we're really trying to understand what the right use case is here. And we want to make sure, to the extent that we do go down this path, that it benefits our stakeholders at large, and it's not just, marginally beneficial. And then we're also looking at, is it just the rule book, or is it a compilation of rule book, enforcement actions, regulatory notices, no action letters, interpretive guidance? Do we want to bring all of that together so that's searchable and easily accessible for firms?
And there are RegTech firms that are also figuring out how to machine read the regulations, even in the form they're in now. I want to turn to one of the hot issues in the regulatory arena and consumer protection, and that's privacy. Dwayne, the FTC is the lead agency on privacy in the United States. Privacy is a much bigger issue than finance. I saw some of you may have seen this, I saw something online this week where there's a boy looking at a computer screen and Mark Zuckerberg is standing over his shoulder. Have you seen this? And the kid is saying, "My dad says you're spying on us." And Mark Zuckerberg says, "He's not your dad." So has the FTC figured out how we should regulate privacy, Dwayne, not to put you on the spot?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think the FTC's approach to privacy has been over the last few years and continues to be based on a number of statutes, including the prohibition against unfair and deceptive acts and practices. A lot of the enforcement actions have been around deception to consumers about how their private information will be treated, and we can go after a company if they're deceptive that way. There's also Graham-Leach-Bliley requirements if they're a financial institution. So I think that's going to continue to be a hot topic. There's also, we recently had, for example, a settlement with a company called Uber, you might have heard of, that involved, which I think was instructive in a number of ways. One of which is that they, for a period of time, gave their employees, and I think also contractors, the ability to see a lot of sensitive information, including geolocation information, without sort of requiring some sort of level of having a need-to-know basis for any of that. The second piece of it is they took a bunch of data and it was on Amazon Web Services, and they failed to adequately secure that. So even though it wasn't data that they were housing themselves, the fact that it was in the cloud didn't obviate the need to protect it. So that's a very recent action, and I think points to the continuing relevance of protecting consumers' private information.
We have a lot of people in the audience who work on compliance in marketing and advertising. What advice do you have for them?
Well, I would say, there's, we do strive to distill and provide as much guidance as we can to industry. So I would actually start by contacting whatever agency is actually regulating you, right? Or that you would fall under the purview. And looking at the publicly available materials, we do have a lot out there, particularly for small businesses. That's been a focus of our acting chair over the last year and a half, is really putting out as much information for small businesses as possible. And if you have questions, don't be afraid to ask. I think that we're happy to engage. We can't provide legal advice, but we do like to spot issues and do what we can to point people in the right direction. It's not in anyone's interest to have something that ends up harming consumers. It's better to get out in front of it. So I would say if you have questions, feel free to reach out.
That seems to be the mantra. Don't be afraid to talk to us just because we're regulators. Tony, you must have thoughts on the advertising and marketing from having led UDAP enforcement at the CFPB.
Yes.
What's the advice there?
So know your regulator, just like sometimes they say know your customer. And I can't emphasize or stress the biggest way that someone determines whether in fact that there's a case that should be opened or an examination that should be taken or prioritized is based on it was marketed this way. or the disclosure in the marketing materials said this. And in fact, the consumer gets the perception of a different type of product or outcome that they thought that they were buying. So, go to your compliance people when you are opening up or starting a new product or product line. You really do have to test it. You have to make sure that you take a look at the history that's out there, both the body of law at the FTC, the state regulators, as well as the CFPB. And if you're an institution that is examined, go to your regional director and try to get guidance there to the extent that you have a good relationship with that particular regulator or that particular examiner. A lot of my cases started that way, with something that someone said is how something worked.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say, at least from where I sit, that UDAP cases have been the driving force in the CFPB's enforcement efforts in recent years, and the FTC to a large extent. We have time for one or two questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question for the panel? I'm going to wait until someone does. I'm sure you do. Thank you. Go ahead.
Do you think at some point the expectation will be that institutions have RegTech solutions and you'll be examining against the presence of them and how they're using them versus against, some of the core regulations themselves? Great question. Who wants to take it?
I would just say that the use of technology in our industry is not new. I think what's new is the use of enhanced and complex technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning. As regulators, we're always going to examine for how firms are using. We're not examining technologies per se, but we will always be examining firms' policies and procedures to make sure that they're compliant with existing rules and regulations. So whether it's internal technology, whether it's with an outside vendor, kind of the nuances and the contours may change, but that element will never go away.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I would say some of the most complex investigations or inquiries that we had dealt with either third parties or others that had moved parts of their database or part of their business line onto computers. And by that means, various algorithms of when they're going to report things or not report things, et cetera, in the FCRA space, for example. And then something goes wrong. And it is, and the FCRA is a very, very technical statute in terms of who's a furnisher, what you report, has someone challenged it, and it's very, very complex. And then the issue is, well, I was only acting at your behest, and you told me that you wanted it to work this particular way. I got it to work that particular way. Who knew that it was not going to comply with the law? So I'm not too sure. This is a rapidly moving environment and ecosystem, and there may come a time in which the regulators would go straight to that aspect and looking at someone measuring them versus RegTech. But I think that we're not there yet, or I don't know how far down the road that would be, but I would say the matters in which I say were the most complex involved that element in which the provider was acting, they felt, at the behest of someone who wanted a turnkey product.
For what it's worth, my answer is I do think so, because I think we're definitely not there yet, but we're going to come to a point where in some areas, it's not going to work for everything, but in some areas, the RegTech is going to be better from the regulator standpoint as well as cheaper for the institution. So much cheaper that it's going to be a competitive advantage for institutions and companies that are using it well. Do we have more questions?
Do you think it's appropriate that state attorney generals pick up the consumer protection torch, or should that be a federal initiative?
Tony, why don't you start that one? Or Dwayne, you look like you wanted to say something. Go for it.
So I would not want to frame the issue to pick up the torch, because I think they've always been there. I think what you saw was a spirit of cooperation because there was a crisis around the mortgage market Prior to that, there's the tobacco model, and there have been others, and there will be others in the future. I think what they've learned after 5 or 6 years of practice, that number one, it's not that hard. Number two, it augments their resources and their spend, and so they get more bang for the buck with fewer people. So I'm not too sure. They clearly are going to do more, but I would not want to say that they're picking up the torch. I think that they've always been there.
I would agree with that. They've been very active. I've worked on a couple of cases that involved all 50 states, right? They have been active in the space, and they often work together with federal counterparts.
Well, thank you. Our time is up. I really want to thank you all for your attention, and thank you to our panel. Thank you.